For the Wild podcast is brought to you in part by support from our partner, the Calliopeia Foundation. Calliopeia honors all life as sacred and works to heal today's issues at their root causes. Calliopeia partners with many projects around a common vision for a future built with love, reverence, and responsibility for our shared home. We are so grateful for Calliopeia's generous support to bring so many inspiring projects to life and for making our show possible every week.
Hey For the Wild community, Ayana here. I want to take a moment to thank the city of Bend, Oregon for generously supporting our work. The Deschutes River winds through the town of Bend and is home to rainbow trout, steelhead, chinook, and sockeye salmon, which are being co-restored by the Wasco, Tenino, and Paiute tribes. Historically, dip netting has been prominent along the Deschutes to harvest fish and is a technique still used today. Over millennia, the water draining from the Cascade Range has carved stunning canyons and rock sculptures along the body of this river, renowned for whitewater rafting. If you visit Bend, we invite you to take the time to visit the water and meditate on the stories it holds. At For the Wild, we're passionate about connecting with water, land, and supporting local economies. We're honored to be collaborating with Bend to spread the word about Pledge for the Wild, a group of mountain towns that support responsible tourism through the preservation of land. Consider supporting and visiting one of my favorite destinations, Bend, Oregon, and help protect the land by giving back at pledgewildbend.com.
The thing that I always say about this is that there's nothing new under the sun. And if you're having an experience, you are not the first person in the world to ever have that experience. And chances are someone in your own blood lineage had that experience, even if it's not recorded, even if you can't find them in the genealogy, even if you don't know their name in the story, there's a memory, like in your tissues, in your blood, in your DNA, there's a memory of this experience that you can tap for wisdom and support.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today we are speaking with Dr. Pavini Moray, pronoun P. Pavini is a somatic sex therapist and ancestral lineage healing practitioner in private practice in San Francisco. Pavini works with individuals and couples who wish to resolve the past, inhabit their bodies and their pleasure, and speak their desires. Pavini is also the founder of Wellcelium, an online sexuality and intimacy school committed to personal and planetary liberation. Pavini hosts a podcast called Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. The podcast is released every new and full moon and addresses topics of transgenerational trauma, erotic wellness, and ancestral support. As a queer trans witch, Pavini walks the glitter path of dancing bones, ridiculous delight, and old magic. Hello, Pavini, and welcome to the show. I have been feeling the call to dig deeper into the topics of ancestral healing, embodiment, and pleasure on the podcast. So I'm really excited to share this space with you today.
It's such an honor to be here today.
Thank you. So just to jump right in, I'd love for you to ground this conversation today by telling us a bit more about your work. How are you weaving together the threads of ancestral connection, embodied wellness, and erotic freedom through your practice and your podcast?
I think that it's important to understand that sex is how we all got here, right? It's through the sex of our ancestors, through thousands and thousands and thousands of folks having sex and fucking and making love and being consensual and non-consensual and all that stuff. Like, that's how we got here. And so when I think about erotic wellness, an essential piece of that is tending to just that acknowledgement of the Eros of our ancestors. And, I think there's such a taboo about talking about sex in families, but there's something really beautiful when we think about the unique expression of each human, right? The unique combination of DNA that combined to create you and you and you comes from this long line of people practicing Eros. And that Eros is this current of creation that runs through all life, right? It's the thing that connects us to every other living thing on this planet is Eros. And so as I hold that in the work that I do, it's really the coming back to the sense of what is it to inhabit our best erotic selves, our most alive selves, the selves that are the most deeply connected, the intuitive knowing, the attunement with other humans, with other than humans, with the earth. The erotic is really the place of its core. It's such a core place. And so to move towards the erotic, right, and especially in a culture where it's so sexualized and pathologized and commercialized, and we're taught so many messages about it, and to come back to it as, oh, this is an original state of wellness, right, of free-flowing Eros. When Eros is allowed to move through us, it's an original state of wellness and of being that we all have the possibility to tap back into.
That was beautiful. Yeah, it's really interesting and curious to see all the shame that's been built around our bodies and Eros and sex when it really is extremely natural. It's how we got here. And it's something that doesn't have to be capitalistic in nature. And so I'm really glad that you're speaking about this topic in this way that's really open and inviting. And yeah, like I was saying earlier, the topic of embodiment is really alive for me right now, particularly in how we're showing up for ourselves and our relationships in this time. On an episode of Bespoken Bones, you shared, quote, "Being embodied gives us more access to all of who we are. When we are not living fully to the full edges of our skin, when we don't have access to all the sensation that's present, we're actually missing out on a huge piece of human being and the human experience," end quote. So first, I want to ask, what holds us back from being present in our bodies? And second, what shifts when we are inhabiting our bodies in a way that is whole, visceral, and pleasurable?
I want to be careful in answering this because I also feel like there's a tyranny of embodiment, that it's that it's like every yoga teacher's like, you must be in your body. And so I really want us to not pathologize not being in our bodies, because like you're asking what holds us back, and it's that we don't feel safe, right? It doesn't feel safe to be in our skin. It feels safer to put our attention outside of our somatic experience, outside of our emotional experience, because the sensations and the emotions are so overwhelming, or they're so painful, so unpleasant, so unbearable, that the smartest, the most wise thing for our bodies is to learn this skill of taking the attention outside of the experience, outside of the embodied experience, right? And so, that's a beautiful, beautiful survival strategy. It's one of those ones that works until it doesn't, and it has costs and it has benefits, just like all of our strategies. And so it's really about readiness, right? Of when is someone ready to make the perilous journey back to the flesh, back to feeling, back to sensation, back to intuition. Because when you're in your body in that way, it becomes really impossible to live out of your integrity, right? You have to be in alignment with your true knowing, and the true knowing that comes from you being a creature in the world, like in the natural world. Yeah. And so many of us, like in order to survive and capitalism, are placing our attention elsewhere, right? We're placing it in, and sometimes those are in really good places that we're placing it. And sometimes it's more distraction. But so I would say that the call back to the body of like, when you feel ready, when you feel like you're ready to experience all of that sensation and emotion and build your capacity to be with, right? To be with what is, it is revolutionary work. And it's in no way supported by our culture. So I think of it like, oh yeah, this is my activism. Like I'm going to be in a non-normative body and I'm going to be feeling it and I'm going to build capacity to feel it all because really I want that and I get to have that. But that's also like, that's years of healing work. Right. And so how do you build embodied safety? How do you start to create a sense of safety inside your own experience? Like, how do you know that your resilience is going to win? How do you know that it outmatches, your fragility or the places that you feel small? And so like that capacity building is an intentional choice and it's an intentional practice that you do over and over and over and over again of bringing the attention back to the body for the sake of feeling. And it means that you have to, when I think about it in terms of like race, for folks who are white, like how do we build capacity to be with the truth of the pain and the harm and the suffering that folks of color endure under white supremacy? And how do we build capacity in our bodies to be with it and not turn away from it and not crumple under the shame of it, of, kind of what our ancestors have done. And that is deep spiritual work to build that capacity.
It feels so important to name the origins of our greater cultural disconnection and dishonoring of the human body and the earth as body. This idea of mind over matter and severance with the body is central to projects of colonialism and white supremacy and remains deeply rooted in dominant Western culture. So I'm wondering, how is this fracturing felt on an embodied level and carried through the generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not felt. Like that's the problem that's the problem of using disembodiment as the continual strategy. Is it's the absence of feeling, right? It's the like when you can other someone else's suffering, right? Because you can't bear to be with it, you can't bear to feel it. And it just perpetuates, like generationally. I think, if children aren't experiencing parents who have the skills to be empathic, empathetic, to feel, as well as to not take it on, to not bear witness, right? To not collapse under it. If they're not getting that modeling, then it just increases of like, oh yeah, this is a good way to be with this disconnect, right? Of just don't notice it, pretend it's not there, pretend it's not happening, right? But I think we're at a point where it's like it's harder and harder for more people to just like pretend that it's not there. More people are like, oh wait, actually, and we feel it through belonging, right? Or disbelonging. We feel it through like, oh, actually, I don't feel connected. I don't feel like I have community. I feel alone. I feel alienated. And so it shows up like that. Yeah.
As you've touched on, being alive in our bodies also means being present with the pain and grief that we not only carry in our psyche, but also within our flesh and bones. When we talk about healing, I think there is an impulse to reject or bind our trauma in that process, disavow our bodies as vessels of great wisdom and information. And as a healing practitioner, how do you approach trauma in your practice and help people feel at home in the complexity of their bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think about trauma a lot as an altered state of consciousness. Like most people just really want to avoid being triggered, right? They don't want to feel their trauma. They don't want to feel their freeze or their shutdown or their fight or their whatever. They don't want to feel that stuff. And so, but if you think about it as that the trauma is an opportunity, right? That it's like an invitation into getting really good at walking in an altered state in your body, right? Because like trauma can be super psychedelic, like the walls start bending and time gets all weird and the floor drops. So, like all that stuff that happens on a somatic level, all the trauma responses that can happen when we're really triggered. it's like, oh, like, what's it like to be someone who is good at navigating those altered states of reality for the sake of really being able to access the gifts of the trauma. And this is kind of a hard sell, right? Because like, you're like, what are the gifts of the trauma? And it's, I would say it's an advanced project. It's not like kind of like trauma 101, right? But like, I am somebody who has a lot of sexual trauma, and being able to be with my own body when that's happening, and allow, like, when it's really intense, there's no way you can hold that much energy in your own body. And so you have to let life hold it, right? It's like you have to let the ocean hold it. You have to let the earth hold it with you, right? Because it's the intensity, the enormity of the intensity of the sensation is just, And so if you can do that and you get good at it, then the things that we gain out of trauma, like exquisite sensitivity, for example. The flip side of it is hypervigilance, right? But like that sensitivity is such a boon to, like, if we can learn to be skillful with it, right? And not just be fragile with it. If we can learn to, like, oh, how do I use my sensitivity that I've gained through trauma to, like, deeply feel into what is this land calling right now? What is life asking of me right now? What is this river asking? What does this mountain need? What does this project call forth? It's like we can start to fine tune those sensitivities that we've gained from trauma. And so I feel like there's like this tremendous value in getting fluent with it and not just shying away from it. But it takes a lot of dedicated effort. It takes a commitment to doing it. And it also takes community support of, like, having good people around you or good animals around you who are, like, going to help you navigate those territories. Because it's like a magical reality, right? Of, like, okay, how do I move through this?
Change, ask the scene to stay for me. Watch the sunlight out, right? I left my words that were chasing in between. And I looked for kindness in the land. If a softness remains, dancer charts his course. He is teasing me for asking to stay. Into the helpless well, dancer folds the eye. His place and his life, listening up to the sky. Humming in the barrenness, is barely standing upright on the ledge. Smiles ringing out of the gold, it's struck and bright in moonless days. Held myself out to his words, I knew the picture well.
from the Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Klook shares, quote, "Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control these processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves," end quote. And I just wanted to read that and as a response to some of the things that you've mentioned. And I think part of what you're speaking to is our cultural inclination towards shame, denial, and dismissal, perhaps. And although trauma is encoded in the self, I wonder about the necessity of healing relationally. One of our greatest powers being to witness one another in our incompleteness and hold a container of safety for our unsettling. So I'm wondering, how does intentional, well-boundaried reciprocity and care for others figure into your paradigm of healing?
I feel so soft in my heart hearing that question. Yeah. Something that I notice, especially in queer culture, and I'm not the first to notice as other people talk about it, is just the lateral violence we do to each other because of our trauma, you know, and also like the weird trauma bonding that we do, right? We say, oh, trauma bonding, that if I'm sharing my trauma with you, like that's intimacy. Like, and I'm like, no, that's not intimacy, that's intensity. And those things are different, right? And knowing your capacity, honoring your capacity, like to be able to play, dance, move in these realms of trauma, like you have to be aware of what your capacity is, and you have to be willing to acknowledge that you have a capacity, right? Like you don't have to be capacityless. I don't even know if that's a word. You don't have to be able to be with everything. You can only do that work insofar as you can be with what's presenting. So for example, I work with deeply traumatized folks around sexual trauma all the time, right? And my capacity to be with that has built over the years that I've been doing the work. Initially, when I started, it was devastating to be with it and really hard, especially like my own stuff would come up and I would get triggered in session, and so how to navigate that and how to do it in a way that you're not minimizing the impact of the stories that you're hearing, right? How to deeply acknowledge it and hold it. And like, sometimes you have a limit, right? Or sometimes you need support. And so I think that's the first thing is really being aware of your capacity and being willing to be honest about that. And sometimes we don't know that we've hit our capacity until we do. Like, oh shit, there was my boundary. Great. Okay. Lesson learned. I think the piece about reciprocity, I'm in long-term partnership and my partner also has sexual trauma. It's been so comforting, right? To be in relationship with somebody who like gets it on a body level, right? That stuff happens during sex and one of us will get triggered, and that's just part of it. Like, that's just part of being a trauma survivor. And so that deep comfort of knowing like, oh, you have gone through things too that are challenging for you. I don't have to justify my experience. And so I feel like that's a place that we can offer that witness and acknowledgement to each other in community is really by like allowing each other to be just how we are and not having to fix each other, not having to, I think it also helps with the white supremacy piece, right? Of like, we don't have to be perfect to be in relationship. It's going to be messy. Are we committed to repair, right? Are we committed to repair with each other when it gets messy? Yeah. So knowing your capacity and being honest about it, being able to share with other people without fixing. The last piece is really about, do you really want to change the experience of what's happening in your body? Like, what percentage of you is willing and what percentage of you is resistant? Like, because trauma is sticky and it can be kind of like compulsive or addictive. And so we can be like working on our trauma in therapy, and then we can be like acting out our trauma in our communities, right? And so just, I think that being in that question with oneself about where am I on that spectrum, right? Not am I willing to work through my trauma so that I can be a good community member, but like, how responsible am I? Because I don't think that trauma excuses you, right? Like, this is the sucky part, that just because somebody has trauma, it's like the person who has it is left holding the bag with it. And it's so super unfair. Yeah. It just sucks. It's not fair that like this person who has been victimized by this thing then now has to like figure out how to heal it and how to like be in community and how to not project it on other people. But that's the deal, right? Like, let's just be honest about it. If we want to have healthy communities, if we want to have healthy reciprocal relationships, we have to start taking responsibility for our wounding and our capacity to do harm because of that wounding. Intimacy is built with time, and it's trust. You've heard what Adrienne Maree Brown has said about it, right? Of like moving at the speed of trust, and that's intimacy, long-term relationship, rupture and repair, rupture and repair, rupture and repair, and being committed to one another. And intensity is just that. It's just like, it makes you feel really alive, like the way adrenaline makes you feel really alive, but it's not a nervous system state that is sustainable, right? And we want to, just tend to our collective nervous system of like, what is it to like start to settle? What's it to start to root again in groundedness and goodness?
That is so helpful to hear about trauma bonding, which is a term I'd never heard before, and intimacy versus intensity. And I know because of this loneliness that so many of us feel, we desperately want to have that connection of intimacy, but really realizing and remembering trust takes time, and we need to build our capacity to hold ourselves as we build trust. And it's such an amazing lesson. And thank you for speaking to that. And there's this question that's been coming up for me a lot recently in relation to movement spaces and how we approach building collective power. And I think so many of us have focused our energies on the deep, urgent issues that connect us without nurturing each other and our relationships. And to me, this means caring about people's shadow sides, their complexities, and showing up for their unraveling and undoing. And I'm really sitting in this question of how creating relational space is part of the way we will be strong earth defenders. I feel like there's so many people who are really connected on the deep issues, but they're not connected in depth to each other.
Yeah. So, a lot of us have strained relationships with family of origin. A lot of us, especially white folks, have deep shame around acts that their ancestors might have perpetrated. And so the idea of connecting ancestrally, it's like, well, those people were fucked up. Why would I want to connect with those people? Because I don't approve. It's not what I would have done. And so we're cut off from a possible resource of blessing and support. And, how I hold it is that the dead are not all equally well. Just because someone dies doesn't give them any special status, right? They're just no longer in a human form. And when we think about connecting with the unseen worlds, the energies, at least that I want to be connecting with, just like I want to have like friends and community that I trust their capacity to self-reflect. I trust their capacity to choose love. The energies in the unseen world, I want to make sure that that is also happening, that I'm not, just because something is unseen doesn't mean it's like super spiritual. It just means it's unseen. And how do we start to vet? How do we start to have discernment practices around what and who we connect with? And so the idea of ancestral healing is really that the dead can change, right? And that possibly they want to change and they want to be in a more well or elevated state. And I've definitely in my own ancestry had this experience of relating with dead people in my lineage who were deeply committed to writing, to repairing, right? So it kind of goes back to our conversation about relationality and repair, of like, that they want that. I'm guessing, I don't know, I'm not dead, but I'm imagining that you have a different perspective once you're dead, and that things that maybe you were practicing or committed to while you were in body just you have different priorities, and you can see things in a different way, and you might really want a chance to make things right. So that can happen, right? We can do this work through ritual. There's lots of different ancestral healing technologies. Some of them you're doing the work yourself. Some of them somebody else is doing that work for you. I'm not judgmental about kind of like how it happens, but I think the idea of like establishing relationship with ancestors is important, and making sure that they are in a good way. Just like we say prayers for our descendants, we say prayers for those who come after us. Like we also say those prayers back in time of like, oh, I want you to be well, because I want to be able to lean back and trust that you're in a good way, and that you've got me, and that this line is thriving, right? That this line that I'm the living face of right now, I'm the right now, that the ones before me and the ones after me, there's goodness, and that there's love that's flowing. And so, yeah, how do you do that? And so that there's the technologies that exist to do that. A lot of them are indigenous technologies. And does that answer the question?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah.
Did I miss any parts?
No. And it's a deep question. Okay. And it's really, I feel like we need to be expansive to be able to take it all in and feel it in our bodies when you're speaking about this, because it's not something that feels linear, or like there's some reductionist model of how to do it. And so, I really feel you. And I'd really love to also hear more about your practice of transcestral healing and experience in supporting LGBTQ clients in ancestral lineage exploration and repair. And I'm wondering how does this process conjure different paradigms of gender and sexuality beyond the Western binary that may be connective or healing for queer and trans folks?
Right. Yeah. The thing that I always say about this is that there's nothing new under the sun. And if you're having an experience, you are not the first person in the world to ever have that experience. And chances are someone in your own blood lineage had that experience, even if it's not recorded, even if you can't find them in the genealogy, even if you don't know their name in the story. There's a memory, like in your tissues, in your blood, in your DNA, there's a memory of this experience that you can tap for wisdom and support. Right. And because folks with othered identities, like queer folks and trans folks, so often feel disconnected from their families of origin, it's like, well, what if we went back in time? Like, what if you could build a time machine and go back and like be with this really, really beloved elder who like totally gets you and is like, oh, child, yeah, of course you're having this experience. There's no words for it. Like they want you to be in this side of the fence or on this side of the fence, but you're not. And your love is beautiful. And the way you are is beautiful. Like, what if we could do that? Right. And so we can, I believe we can. And I think it's deeply nourishing and healing to lean in there and rewrite the orphan narratives, right? Of like, oh yeah, I deeply belong in my queer lineage, and they can really get my struggles, and maybe they use different language, and maybe they had different words for it, or maybe they didn't even have words for it, but they get it. And I'm not alone, and I didn't come from nowhere. Like this experience that I'm having that is challenging, painful, struggle, beautiful, like that it's a blessing from my lineage. Yeah. And and so like when I think about like transcestors, I'm thinking about both the ones in our blood, those people who had varied gender experiences, as well as the mighty trans dead, the dead like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Lou Sullivan, the ones who worked in their lives really intensely for liberation, and who have provided these like role models and paths that we can follow and lineages that we can build on. And so it's like it's both the blood and the ancestors of heart is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about transcestors. And yeah, I think that that recognition that these things are actually blessings, and that, we are in a time of deep ecological crisis. And here, nature is responding by providing all these trans folks. And like, what are trans folks good at? Trans folks are good at shape-shifting. Trans folks are good at holding complexity. Trans folks are good at walking the edges. Like, these are like built-in skill sets that you just like, when you get your trans card, they just like hand these out, right? They're like, okay, get your gift bag here with all these skills, right? And they're needed skills. They're like really important skills for this time. But because transphobia is so prevalent, like that gets internalized, and people aren't like, oh, look at this bag of superpowers I just got. They're not really aware of it. They don't know the power. I mean, I think we know, we feel it, but it's so pathologized and it's so hated. So my sense of it is that it's just like it's an ecological corrective for humanity, and that over the course of evolution, over the course of time, when we look back, this moment will be a great pivot, will be a great turning, like Joanna Macy says, and trans folks play a huge role in that.
I'm really thinking into this ancestral healing, and especially for white settlers who carry both privilege of oppression and privilege in our bloodlines. I'll speak about myself within that. And I was really moved by your conversation on Bespoken Bones with Tada Hazumi, in which they raised the point that many white people turn towards practices like yoga that resource their healing power from POC spiritual traditions. So I'm really sitting with this big question of how do we ensure that white folks are not replicating the same colonial patterns of extraction within our quest for self-care and wellness, and maybe even adding on to white folks, but also white cisgendered folks as well.
In particular about ancestral healing or just in general?
Well, yeah, I would say in ancestral healing, like there's this question of whether it's white settlers or kind of this dominant mentality. Like what I find is it seems like probably everybody needs healing on multiple levels, but how we go about that healing and not bring in that dominant narrative that takes and consumes something from outside of us to make it our own in order for us to heal. And so I definitely see it with white settlers taking POC and indigenous ways of healing and trying to, consciously or unconsciously make it their own without proper acknowledgments. But I'd also imagine that that's probably happening in queer spaces as well, taking from the work of queer and trans folks and coming in and reaching for something that feels genuine, feels like it's a healing modality, and not really giving proper acknowledgement, but also taking the healing and just perpetuating the type of oppressions that are. So I know that seems like a really maybe too spread out of a question, but yeah, I just want to speak to that because when we're talking about ancestral healing and healing of these wounds, I want to make sure that we're all being aware of how to do it in a good way and not stripping people who are already oppressed of their connections and modalities.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate it. What comes to mind is, so I went on an ancestral pilgrimage in 2016 and to Scotland, where my people are from. And I did a lot of research ahead of time, the places that I wanted to go. I had conversations like with people who had been on pilgrimages, just did a lot of probably 6 or 8 months of prep. And in a conversation that I had with one person, what they told me was, hey, like all of the things that you want to know about your people, all the things that you want to know about the traditions and the rituals and the prayers and the songs and the spiritual practices, like they actually encoded it all in the land. It's actually all there because of when the Christians came, the Druids were like, they saw what was happening. They saw the erasure that was happening of traditional culture there. And so they used magical practices and spiritual technologies to encode it into the land, into the place names, into the standing stones and the stone circles. And so if you go there, you can figure out how to unlock some of that. And whatever, I was like, oh my God, that's the hippiest thing I've ever heard, okay. But it actually was my experience and of going and like, again, it comes from the embodiment though, right? From the willingness to attune, was able to go and to listen with my body. And like, I could feel when I was making a misstep, or I could feel when I was doing something incorrectly. And so like, it just was like, kind of like a exploration of like, okay, how, like, for example, how do you approach a sacred site? Right? What's the right way? Oh, it's not the same for every sacred site. It's different for each one. Each one has its own specific keys. And so you have to figure those out. How do you figure those out? Well, you have to get quiet and you have to listen. And when you think, like, oh, I should sing this song to this beautiful stone and see if that works, and then just like track, like, did that work? Am I allowed to come in yet? Like, what's the way of your people, Pavini? And so, and really having, but like that entrainment and that attunement is available. We just have to listen to it. Right. And so it's not speaking directly to your question, but we don't need to use other people's technologies if they're not freely given. Like some people freely give their technologies and that's a beautiful thing to receive. But if it's not freely given, then we don't need to do that because white folks have their own beautiful technologies that, and not everybody can take a bunch of time off work and go on a pilgrimage. And, I think that made it exquisitely accessible to do it like that for me, because I've been able to do it here too, of just like listening and waiting and that patient waiting and being willing to be with the not knowing. of like, what's the right way to make an offering to this tree? Okay, well, I don't know. I'm not just going to like do it. I'm going to like wait until I think I know, and then I'm going to do it. I'm going to check in with my body. I'm going to kind of like listen to the tree. Like, oh, that went well. That's the way to make the offering to that tree today. Great. Yeah. But it's that willing to be with the not knowing, to not have to know, which I think is part of white fragility, is this having to know piece. Yeah.
Well, I think you answered that really wonderfully, because I agree. How to not bring settler mentality into healing spaces or ancestral healing is, I think, being able to sit with the unknown, being able to sit with this discomfort and humbling ourselves to take the time, whether or not we go on a pilgrimage or not. It could be our backyards. It could be the street that we walk on every day. I mean, I think that the land everywhere has this magic and this knowing, whether it's concreted or not. But that type of patience and humility, I think, really is maybe not the key, but definitely on the key chain of how we begin that healing. The music you heard today was from Itasca. Their record Spring came out on November 1st, and they're a big supporter of the podcast. So please support them by going to wherever you get your music and download. I would like to take this moment and thank our team: Aidan McCrae, Andrew Storrs, Carter Lou McElroy, Erica Eckram, Aaron Wise, Francesca Glassbell, Hannah Wilton, Melanie Younger, and Suzanne Dollywall. Tune in next week for part 2 of my interview with Dr. Pavini Moray.